So just a disclaimer here at the top, this is not going to be a lighthearted video log. I'm going to talk about a particular topic and subject matter that is going to be distressing, is going to talk about real life atrocities and injustices, and I'm going to talk about media connected to this particular topic that doesn't shy away from being brutally honest about its depiction. Because, as you may have known within the past couple of days, a depiction of an account of the Holocaust was banned in a school district, and it just happens to be, I don't know if one of my favorites is a term I want, but it just happens to be one of the more compelling pieces of literature that I've engaged with in my life, and that was Art Spiegelman's MAUS. For those that don't know, Art Spiegelman is a writer, a cartoonist, and is the son of a Holocaust survivor. And decades ago, he decided to chronicle his father's story in the format of a graphic novel, of a comic book. And a little bit about my own connection to MAUS. MAUS has been around me for most of my life. My dad, when he was younger, was a very avid, not just reader of comic books, but also of counterculture stuff, and explored a lot of, like, say, underground comics and things like that. And I found MAUS in my parents' basement when I was very young. And at the time, I was just getting into comics and cartoons and things like that. So I immediately see this book with cartoon mice and cats, and ask my parents about this. Like, what is this? Is this like Donald Duck or Mickey Mouse or Uncle Scrooge or something like that? Is it like Batman? And my folks, rather than immediately pearl clutch and slap the book away from me and say, never, they sat me down to give me context. This 9 or 10-year-old boy, they sat me down to explain that this wasn't like the comic books I was reading at the time. This wasn't like a Marvel or DC superhero story. This wasn't like a Disney funny book type of experience. This was something very different. And that if I was serious about wanting to read it, if I was genuinely curious about exploring it further beyond those simple visual aesthetics, then they wanted to explore it with me. They wanted to be sure that I could ask questions of them. They could ask questions of me to make sure I was comprehending what the story was about, that they would provide insight and they would provide some continuing education about this story. And I agreed to that. And they guided me through reading this. They read it to me. They explained and elaborated aspects of it to me. And by the time my regular school curriculum came around to World War II history and touching upon the Holocaust very briefly, because now looking back on it, my mainstream educational curriculum was sorely lacking in those aspects. And the reason why I can acknowledge it now is because I remember getting into World War II and Holocaust history in regular schooling and feeling like, why aren't we talking about other aspects? Why aren't we talking and getting more in depth? Why isn't there a more comprehensive kind of exploration of not just the military campaigns or the setup of the Reich, but also into the survivors' stories, into actually chronicling and talking about what went on in the camps. And so I guess that's what's kind of kickstarted this video log, is my sort of reaction to hearing that this is being denied to younger readers. Initially, for very superficial, what looks like to be very superficial details, like, oh, it takes the Lord's name in vain, or oh, there's some nudity in it, which I feel is all just thinly veiled kind of shielding from the real reason, which is, I feel it's some motivation on school district members' part to sequester it away for the safety of the children for some reason, or on a more sinister possibility that it's a veiled kind of revisionist type of approach. If it's not there, we don't have to talk about it, which honestly takes it to some far, like I said, more sinister, malicious places, such as anti-Semitism and perpetuating anti-Semitism. So it got me thinking and got me revisiting, because I'm a channel here that talks about movies. I talk about film, the movies and shows and representations in media that stay with me, and that's definitely an angle that I've been wanting to redirect to for a while, and that I've been slowly kind of gearing myself towards. And again, I just want to let you know that this isn't going to be a happy-go-lucky sort of exploration of some films or some TV shows. I'm going to talk very somberly about this stuff. So let me just get right into it. Some films, some shows, some expressions through the medium of film and movies that I feel are worth exploring if you want to get a more comprehensive or a less, let's say, sanitized exploration of this particular piece of world history. So first up, might not be a shock to a lot of people, but absolutely, Schindler's List. Spielberg, known for making a lot of varied types of films, high concept, action adventure, fantasy, family friendly. But at the end of the day, I genuinely believe this is going to be the piece that will have the longest lasting legacy for him in terms of it being probably as close to a depiction of what really went down in those camps as is possible, without over romanticizing in typical Hollywood fashion or oversimplifying, without trivializing the narrative for the sake of the audience's feelings, with just being as brutally honest as is possible about how a section of people were treated and ultimately almost annihilated. Schindler's List, I feel, as much as it can deliver the tears and emotions and moods connected more with, well, there was an individual, Oskar Schindler, doing what he could for those people. It also doesn't shy away from saying that it wasn't enough. And it stays with you. I don't know what else I can contribute to the conversation about Schindler's List that hasn't already been said in much more eloquent terms or in a wider breadth and scope. It's absolutely a required viewing if you're going to explore the idea of the Holocaust represented in media in a serious way, in a way that it doesn't trivialize the real world events. This is absolutely one of those pieces that I feel is a necessity. Another piece of media, which is actually streaming on Netflix right now, that I would recommend to you. It's a documentary that actually was executive produced by Steven Spielberg and the Shoah Foundation. Well, even before I get to that, one thing that I'm looking forward to completing, I've seen part and parcels of it, is Shoah, the documentary from 1985. That, I believe, is available in its full length on Amazon, if you're able to find it. So I not looking forward to it, but I am anticipating getting into exploring it a little bit and really taking to heart these true life accounts. And The Last Days, to kind of go hand in hand with Shoah, is an extension of that. Not as lengthy. It's about an hour and 30 minutes perhaps. But it is a documentary that follows a handful of survivors from Hungary that were originally in the Hungary Budapest area when the Nazis were doing roundups and interning people in camps. And it is, again, unapologetic with its candidness and its forthcomingness and honesty. These people just tell their stories, and they're heartbreaking stories. What it was like to be forcibly separated from their families, to know that their parents were automatically being sent to their deaths and that they were going to just be spending out the rest of their, short lives in camps. The lengths that they went to hang on to some form of identity or to hang on to some form of their souls or spirituality. The follow-up, the aftermath of being liberated, and how even though you're liberated, the trauma, the scars, the nightmares endure. The not knowing what happened to the rest of your family endures. There's a lot of moments in this documentary that you will be astonished in a very hollowing way too. There's a point where a survivor is conferring with a former SS doctor that was in the same camp as they were, asking questions about, like, would you happen to know what happened to my family? And this interaction floored me in a lot of ways when I first saw it. First off, floored me in how the survivor can keep themselves so composed and so dignified in the face of someone who most likely was a primary source of their torment. And also how detached and how clinical the former SS doctor is, and how they're devoid of empathy or emotion with regards to it, and just saying, like, this was just the way it was. It astonished me on both those levels. And other moments throughout this documentary, you have one of the survivors go back to Dachau, which was the camp that they were processed in, with their son. And I've been to Dachau. Many years ago when I was in high school, there was a summer exchange program that a group of us were part of. And Dachau was one of the sites on our itinerary that we were visiting. And so watching this documentary, I recall seeing the same locations, the gas chamber, the crematorium, and seeing the survivor walk through them. Like, just being in those spaces in person, even though, like I said, I have no personal connection in terms of my family ties or my heritage to that specifically region or region of the globe or that period of history. And I got emotional being in that space, just imagining, like, what it would be like to have all these people confined together in this space awaiting their doom. Imagining what it would be like if you were in that situation, or if people you loved were in that situation. Like, that got to me, being there in that moment. I can't imagine what it would be like for someone to come back 40, 50 years later and have to revisit those ghosts and those memories all over again. And the documentary is very, it cuts to the quick about that. There are sometimes these very pregnant moments of silence where they've just run out of things to say, Like they'll talk about like, oh, here's where the barrack, here's where the fencing was, or where I had to step over a dead body, collect their shoes, and we go around with carts to get bodies out of the way. Like they'll just run out of things to reflect upon. And there's a pregnant pause and silence in the air. And you just see this person just break down. Like, that's a sharing of a story that stays with you. That's a candidness and unbelievably unfiltered testimonial that you won't forget. And you shouldn't forget. So, The Last Days, watch it. It's very moving, but also very heavy of a documentary. But absolutely, I feel is a necessity to watch to get an idea of just how horrific and how prolonged the suffering was for these people. This is something that I recently found myself getting into, which was this series from Polish TV called Decalogue. It's a 10-part series created and directed by Krzysztof Kieslowski, who did the Three Colors trilogy, one of my favorite series of films. And there's a segment of it, the 8th one, that is a vignette about a Holocaust survivor kind of coming back to where their life was before they were rounded up and put in a camp. And when they confront individuals that were in their lives prior to that. And when they confront them about either their complacency or inaction or being complicit in their suffering. It is a quieter, well, the series overall is a very quieter series. And this particular vignette, it isn't an amplified story with regards to melodrama. It's much more subdued, much more hypnotic and quiet. But there are some very memorable interactions in it. One is when basically a pursuit of some kind is taking place through the old neighborhood block that this person is revisiting. And I don't want to give too much away with regards to revelations in the stories, but it does delve into the complexities that involve those in the community and their varying degrees of activity or inactivity. The factors that played into someone's inability to stand up for their fellow person. And it doesn't offer an easy solution in the end. It doesn't, just off the nature of it being a little bit more avant-garde, there is a degree of perhaps romanticizing the visual aspect of it, but I found it to be a very interesting kind of watch and dissection of that idea of what survivors, I feel, eventually have to confront for themselves. Not just the ghosts of what they lost in the camps, but the ghosts of those that kind of remain and stick around and are reminders of being put in the camps. So the 8th installment of Decalogue, I feel, is another essential viewing. Next up, I might have talked about this at some point in other video logs or reviews. This is the HBO film's Conspiracy from the early 2000s. This is actually based on the minutes and notes found regarding a conference in Wannsee towards the end of the war, where a lot of the SS and Reich officials convened to discuss the final solution. And this is a different look into the Holocaust with regards to just how cold and calculating and how the zealotry is justified and rationalized for these individuals. There's varying degrees of political manipulation taking place throughout the interactions, talking about basically how the SS ran ramshackle over all other branches of the government and basically just alerted everyone to the idea of like, hey, this is what we've been doing. We're just going to amp it up some more here at the death throes of our military campaign. But also it doesn't absolve any of the other individuals who might have played, say, a lesser role in the proceedings. If anything, it shines a harsher light on those who chose to just go along with the machinery because that would just be easier for them. A lot of individuals at this conference utilize bureaucracy and the rule of law to justify their anti-Semitism, to justify how their approach to dealing with the Jewish population was superior to that of the SS, and they were just basically squandered out of an opportunity for political progression. And so it's an aggravating film to watch, certainly. It's aggravating. It's well acted, well shot, well composed, but it's aggravating to hear how these people in power trivialized and commodified human life. Millions of lives. How they basically, even in casual throwaway conversation, dehumanize them. And how that eventually leads to the genocide that it was, or perpetuated the genocide that was taking place. So yeah, I think it goes without saying, a lot of these films are, you have to be, I feel, mentally and emotionally ready to delve into them. Like, I don't delve into these movies for the sake of it being a casual Saturday viewing or something like that, something where I can just have it kind of be this frivolous thing in the background. No, these are movies I feel demand a focused and mature mind to engage with them properly. And that brings me to my last recommendation, I guess, if you feel that is something you want to do for your own personal growth and education and reflection, is the final film I want to recommend, Au revoir, les enfants, from 1987, directed by Louis Malle, and I believe is somewhat autobiographical about his time growing up in France at that point, and what he witnessed as a schoolboy, essentially. And I feel this film, again, very well put together, very beautifully acted and composed, but it covers a couple of different levels. It covers the perspective of a Jewish person in hiding. It covers the perspective of a bystander, essentially a young boy whose eyes are finally being opened to what this world is. It delves into the perspective of those that are passive in the comings and goings of the Gestapo and their cohorts and what they set out to inflict on the Jewish people. It delves into the perspective of those that went out of their way to protect their fellow men and women, those that went out of their way to hide and conceal their Jewish neighbors. And also the perspective of those that looked for a pat on the head from whom they determined would be the reigning power. Those that were opportunistic enough to sell out their fellow person for their own personal advancement. And so this movie, I feel, explores all of that through different facets, but again, done through the perspective of a young person kind of losing their innocence in this moment, recognizing the world for what it is and what it can be at its worst. It's a very, again, like I said with all these movies, it's a very difficult movie in the end. There's no grand sweeping romantic happy ending for any of these stories. And I feel that's okay. That's necessary. I feel, especially in the westernized perception of media tied to historical events and things like that, that there's this perception I feel from a general audience that if there is no happy ending, it's not worth engaging with. That if we can't take away some uplifting moral message at the end of the day, then what's the point? And I'm not saying there isn't merit to escapism. There isn't merit to those morality plays that we crave to have a desired happy ending with. I enjoy those. I enjoy high fantasy. I enjoy epic dramas. I enjoy romantic comedies. I enjoy superhero IP, what have you, for that escapism. But I feel there is a necessity for art and for films and TV and documentaries that don't give you that you have to sit with, that you have to absorb, as a means of being able to progress yourself, if not the world in general. You know, the gravity of what the Holocaust was shouldn't be forgotten. The long-lasting trauma and violence that was inflicted upon these people shouldn't be forgotten. Father of Art Spiegelman, his story shouldn't be forgotten. Because otherwise we're just going to keep going back into the loop. The perpetual loop of being cruel, unnecessarily cruel to one another. And, you know, it's not going to be something that's an overnight fix, clearly. Utopia is just this far-reached fantasy that I feel we'll never see in our lifetimes. There's always going to be cruelty. I understand that. There's always going to be violence and injustices, and especially systemic failures for marginalized people. That's always going to be here, I feel. But what can be done is mitigating the severity of those injustices, of being able to respond faster in the face of those injustices, of being able to know right out of the gate, like, this is wrong, to maybe prevent something worse from taking place because we had the foresight, because we had the knowledge that we had accrued from previous lessons in history to say, this isn't the way. And I feel that all, again, just ties back into allowing our future generations to experience this for themselves. These stories, brutally and honestly, whatever these stories were, to not feel we have to protect them from something like this, to not clutch our pearls and say, oh, won't you think of the children? Like I said, I learned about the Holocaust and about these particular stories at an age that predated my own general education about World War II and that particular moment in history. And all it did was strengthen something positive in me, I feel. It strengthened my need to empathize and my need to be compassionate. It strengthened the belief that this was fundamentally just wrong on every level. An absolute pure act of evil against a people and a population that wasn't deserving of it. And if we continue to deny that through our movies, through our TV, through our books, if we continue to deny those lessons because we feel our kids can't handle it, then we're just setting ourselves up for something worse down the line. Your kids can handle it. They're smarter and far more intuitive than you give them credit for. And if you feel you still have apprehensions about them learning about MAUS or about Schindler's List or Revoir les Enfants or any of the media or stories pertaining to this real life tragedy, be there with them for it, like my parents were. Give them context, give them support, encourage them to ask questions. So, I know we're wrapping up January and going into a month that, is meant to focus on and reflect on the trials and tribulations of another group of marginalized people. Continue to explore this venue and continue to expand your perspectives on Black History Month. I promise I'll be more fun in the next video log.